The last video call before his deployment had been filled with his daughter's excited chatter about starting school, about the books she wanted to read, about all the adventures they would have when Daddy came home. But when Captain Rodriguez finally walked through that door 18 months later, his 6-year-old daughter Lucia had become a ghost of herself, speaking only in whispers, so quiet he had to strain to hear them. What she was finally able to tell him in those terrified whispers would shatter everything he thought he knew about the people he had trusted with his most precious treasure. Captain Miguel Rodriguez had earned his rank through 18 months of hell in some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. A decorated officer with a Bronze Star and Purple Heart, he was the kind of leader his men followed without question. But every firefight, every dangerous mission had been endured with one driving force: the memory of his daughter Lucia's voice, bright and confident, telling him about her day. Before deployment, Lucia Rodriguez had been a force of nature. At 4 years old, she was precocious beyond her years, with an endless stream of questions and observations that kept her father constantly entertained. She was the child who sang made-up songs while coloring, who told elaborate stories about her stuffed animals, who could chatter happily for hours about anything that crossed her mind. Her voice had been her superpower, confident, curious, fearless. She would call out to neighbors from their front yard, strike up conversations with strangers at the grocery store, and narrate her entire day from the moment she woke up until she finally fell asleep. 3 weeks before deployment, they had shared what would be their final video call together. Lucia had been bubbling with excitement about starting kindergarten, holding up new books she couldn't wait to read, describing the backpack she had picked out covered in butterflies. "Daddy, when you come home, I'm going to read you all my new books," she had announced with absolute confidence. "And I'm going to tell you about every single day at school, and about my new friends, and about everything I learned." That confident, joyful voice had carried him through the darkest moments overseas. When enemy fire pinned down his unit, when he wondered if he'd ever see home again, he would remember that bright, fearless chatter and find the strength to keep fighting. The deployment orders came suddenly. 18 months in a volatile region where communication would be limited and dangerous. Rodriguez knew he had no choice but to trust his sister-in-law Elena with Lucia's care. Elena seemed responsible, had children of her own, and promised to treat Lucia like family. "Don't worry about anything, Miguel," Elena had assured him. "Lucia will be safe and loved. I'll take good care of her." Elena Vasquez had initially seemed perfect for the role. She was family, lived in a safe neighborhood, and her own children were well-behaved and happy. Rodriguez arranged generous monthly support, more than enough to ensure Lucia would have everything she needed. Elena's promises were convincing: regular video calls with Lucia, photos documenting her progress, updates about school and friends. For the first few months, everything seemed ideal, but gradually the communications became less frequent, more controlled. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Elena had quickly grown to resent Lucia's presence. The monthly payments were welcome, but Lucia's confident, outgoing personality clashed with Elena's need for a quiet, controlled household. The child who had once filled rooms with laughter now represented chaos that needed to be managed. Elena began implementing strict rules about when Lucia could speak, how loudly she was allowed to talk, and what topics were acceptable for discussion. Any violation resulted in immediate punishment: time alone in her room, missed meals, isolation from the other children. Over months, Elena's campaign against Lucia's voice became increasingly sophisticated and cruel. She convinced the child that her natural speaking voice was too loud, that her questions were annoying, and that her stories were lies that disturbed the peace. The psychological conditioning was relentless and methodical. Lucia was told that good children spoke only when spoken to, that her father had left because she talked too much, and that if she ever wanted to see him again, she needed to learn to control her voice. Elena would time Lucia's responses, insisting that taking too long to answer questions was disrespectful, while speaking too quickly was rude and thoughtless. The rules became increasingly complex and contradictory. Lucia was expected to respond immediately when asked direct questions, but forbidden from volunteering information or observations. She could speak about practical matters like being hungry or needing the bathroom, but any mention of feelings, memories of her father, or creative thoughts was met with harsh correction. Elena instituted a point system, where Lucia lost privileges for each violation of the voice rules. Too loud, lose dessert. Too many questions, no bedtime story. Speaking without permission, eat dinner alone in her room. The arbitrary nature of the punishments kept Lucia in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing which word might be the one that crossed an invisible line. Gradually, Lucia's confident chatter diminished to nervous requests, then to barely audible whispers, and finally to silence broken only when absolutely necessary. Elena had successfully weaponized shame and fear to steal a child's voice, replacing natural expression with terrified compliance. The most insidious part was how Elena framed this transformation as positive progress. When neighbors asked about Lucia, Elena would smile and say, "She's finally learning to be a well-behaved young lady." Children these days need to learn the value of quiet reflection. To outside observers, Lucia appeared to be a remarkably well-behaved child, when in reality, she was a victim of systematic psychological control. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door, began noticing disturbing changes in the little girl she had once enjoyed chatting with over the fence. Lucia had transformed from a bright, talkative child to a shadow who scurried past without making eye contact. "I used to hear her singing in the backyard," Mrs. Chen confided to her husband. "Now she moves around like she's afraid to make any sound at all." The school counselor noticed similar changes. Lucia, who had started kindergarten as an engaged, participatory student, became withdrawn and silent. When teachers tried to encourage her participation, she would look terrified and whisper responses so quietly they could barely be heard. Rodriguez's attempts to maintain contact with Lucia became increasingly frustrating. Video calls that had once featured his daughter's excited chatter were replaced by brief, stilted conversations where Lucia barely spoke above a whisper and seemed terrified to say anything substantial. Elena's explanations were always plausible. "She's tired," or "she's going through a shy phase," or "she misses you so much that talking makes her too emotional." But something felt fundamentally wrong. The confident, joyful child he remembered seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by a frightened shadow who flinched at the sound of her own voice. When 3 months passed without any meaningful communication with Lucia, Rodriguez made the decision that would change everything. He requested emergency leave, citing family concerns that required his immediate attention. "I need to see my daughter," he told his commanding officer. "Something's wrong, and I can't fix it from here." The approval came through quickly, and Rodriguez was on a flight home before Elena knew he was coming. Rodriguez arrived at Elena's house expecting to surprise his daughter with an early return. Instead, he found a child who barely resembled the confident little girl he had left behind. Lucia had lost weight, moved like she was afraid of making noise, and spoke in whispers so faint he had to lean close to hear her. The house itself felt different, oppressively quiet in a way that seemed unnatural for a home with children. When Elena answered the door, her surprise quickly turned to defensive irritation. "Miguel, you didn't tell me you were coming. Lucia isn't prepared for visitors." "Visitors?" Rodriguez felt a chill. "I'm her father." When Lucia finally appeared, the transformation was heartbreaking. She approached slowly, her footsteps careful and measured, as if she had been trained to move without disturbing anyone. Her once bright eyes now darted nervously between her father and Elena, clearly calculating whether it was safe to show any emotion. When she first saw him, there was no joy, no excited running into his arms. Instead, she shrank back, eyes wide with what looked like fear of getting in trouble for some unknown transgression. She glanced at Elena before speaking, as if seeking permission to acknowledge her own father. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "I've been good. I've been very quiet, like Elena told me." The words hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't his daughter. This was a child who had been systematically broken and rebuilt according to someone else's twisted specifications. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His daughter hadn't just become shy. She had been systematically terrorized into silence. Even more disturbing was how Lucia seemed to monitor her own volume constantly, catching herself if her whisper threatened to become audible and immediately reducing it further. She had been so thoroughly conditioned that self-censorship had become automatic, involuntary. Rodriguez's military training kicked in as he assessed the situation with the tactical precision of a combat veteran. This wasn't normal childhood development. This was the result of systematic psychological abuse designed to break a child's spirit. When he confronted Elena about Lucia's condition, her defensive responses revealed the truth. She didn't deny the changes, instead justifying them as necessary discipline for a child who had been too unruly and disrespectful of authority. She needed to learn to control herself, Elena said without shame, her voice rising with indignation as if she were the victim. Children today are allowed to be too loud, too demanding. I taught her better manners. You should be thanking me for fixing her behavior problems. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in deflection and victim blaming. Elena portrayed herself as a selfless caregiver who had sacrificed her own peace and comfort to civilize an out-of-control child. She spoke about Lucia as if she were discussing a wild animal that had needed to be tamed rather than a traumatized 6-year-old girl. Do you have any idea how disruptive she was when you first left her here? Elena continued, warming to her subject. Constantly chattering, asking questions, making noise at all hours. My own children couldn't concentrate on their homework because of her constant interruptions. I had to establish boundaries for the good of everyone in this house. Rodriguez listened with growing horror as Elena detailed her methods with pride rather than shame. She had documented Lucia's progress in a notebook, tracking the child's daily word count and celebrating each reduction in verbal expression as a victory. She showed him charts and graphs measuring Lucia's improvement in volume control and response time. Look at these results, Elena said, flipping through pages of data as if she were presenting a successful business proposal. In just 6 months, I reduced her unnecessary vocalizations by 80%. Her compliance rate increased to nearly 100%. She went from being disruptive and attention-seeking to being a model of proper behavior. Rodriguez realized he was looking at someone who had deliberately destroyed his daughter's confidence and stolen her voice, all while accepting money meant to provide her with love and care. More disturbing still, Elena genuinely believed she had performed a service, that breaking a child's spirit was equivalent to improving their character. Over the following days, as Lucia slowly began to trust that she wouldn't be punished for speaking, the full scope of Elena's psychological campaign became clear. She had been forbidden from speaking above a whisper, punished for asking questions, and told repeatedly that her natural personality was defective and needed to be corrected. Most devastatingly, Elena had convinced Lucia that her father's absence was punishment for being too noisy, and that if she ever wanted him to love her again, she needed to become the kind of quiet, invisible child who wouldn't cause problems. The systematic destruction of a child's voice wasn't accidental. It had been deliberate, calculated, and sustained over months with the specific goal of breaking Lucia's spirit. As Rodriguez spent more time with his daughter, additional disturbing details emerged. Lucia revealed that Elena had installed a decibel meter app on her phone, using it to measure the volume of Lucia's voice throughout the day. Any reading above Elena's arbitrary threshold resulted in immediate consequences: missed meals, isolation, or being forced to stand silently in a corner for hours. She would make me practice whispering the same sentence over and over until it was quiet enough, Lucia confided during one of their conversations. Sometimes I had to say I'm sorry for being too loud 100 times, getting quieter each time, until she couldn't hear me anymore. Elena had also implemented a reward system that was designed to reinforce the behavior modification. Lucia could earn small privileges, like 5 extra minutes at bedtime or a piece of fruit with lunch, by maintaining complete silence for specified periods. The longest period Lucia had achieved was 6 hours of total silence, a feat that Elena had celebrated as a major breakthrough. Perhaps most disturbing was Elena's documentation system. She had kept detailed records of Lucia's vocal infractions, noting not just volume levels, but also content that she deemed inappropriate. Questions about her father were marked as manipulation attempts. Expressions of sadness or homesickness were labeled attention-seeking behavior. Even humming or singing quietly to herself was recorded as unauthorized sound production. The records revealed that Elena had contacted child behavior specialists, not to get help for a potentially traumatized child, but to get professional validation for her suppression techniques. She had selectively shared information with these experts, portraying Lucia as a severely disruptive child who required intensive behavioral intervention. Rodriguez approached the legal system with the same methodical determination he had applied to military operations. He documented everything: Lucia's psychological state, Elena's admissions about her discipline methods, and expert testimony about the long-term effects of psychological abuse on children. Child psychologists who evaluated Lucia confirmed that her condition was consistent with systematic emotional abuse designed to suppress natural childhood behaviors. The transformation from confident child to terrified whisperer didn't happen naturally. It required sustained psychological pressure over extended periods. The case became a landmark in understanding how psychological abuse could be just as damaging as physical violence, particularly when it targeted a child's basic ability to communicate and express themselves. As news of Lucia's case spread, it sparked conversations about forms of child abuse that often went unrecognized because they left no physical marks. Child advocates used her story to highlight how systematic psychological control could devastate a child's development while appearing to outside observers as simply good discipline. Military family support organizations rallied around Rodriguez's case, recognizing how deployed service members' children were particularly vulnerable to such abuse. New protocols were developed to ensure better oversight and more frequent welfare checks for military children in care arrangements. Elena was convicted of child psychological abuse and sentenced to 2 years in prison, along with mandatory counseling and a lifetime ban from providing childcare services. The judge noted that stealing a child's voice through systematic intimidation represented a particularly cruel form of abuse that attacked the very core of human development. But for Rodriguez, the legal victory was less important than the slow process of helping his daughter reclaim her voice and confidence. Recovery was measured in small victories. The first time Lucia spoke in her normal voice without prompting, the first time she asked a question without fear, the first time she laughed loudly without immediately looking around to see if she would be punished. Professional therapy helped both father and daughter understand that healing would take time. Lucia had to relearn that her voice was valuable, that her thoughts mattered, and that speaking up was not only acceptable, but encouraged. The most breakthrough moment came during a therapy session, when Lucia was encouraged to tell her father something she had been afraid to say. What she whispered revealed the depth of the psychological control she had endured, but also marked the beginning of her journey back to herself. 6 months into their healing journey, as they sat together reading bedtime stories, Lucia turned to her father with eyes that still held traces of the fear that had been instilled in her. "Daddy," she whispered, though her whisper was now by choice rather than terror. "Can I tell you the scariest thing Elena ever said to me?" Rodriguez set down the book and gave her his complete attention. "You can tell me anything, Mija. You never have to be afraid to use your voice with me." What Lucia whispered next revealed the full psychological manipulation she had endured. "Elena told me that if I ever spoke louder than a whisper, it would prove that I didn't love you enough to be good while you were gone. She said that every time I made noise, it was like sending you a message that I wanted you to stay away forever." The confession continued, each whispered revelation showing how Elena had weaponized Lucia's love for her father against her. She had been told that quiet children were the only ones whose fathers came home from war, that loud children caused their parents to get hurt in battle, and that her natural personality was dangerous to the people she loved most. "I was so scared that if I talked normal, something bad would happen to you," Lucia whispered. "So I made my voice as small as possible, hoping it would keep you safe." As the weeks passed, more painful truths emerged in their nightly conversations. Elena had created elaborate stories about other military children whose fathers had been killed because they were too noisy at home. She had shown Lucia news articles about soldiers who died in combat, claiming that their children's loud voices had somehow caused the deaths by distracting Daddy during important missions. The psychological manipulation had been so sophisticated that Lucia had genuinely believed her voice could kill her father. Every laugh, every question, every moment of natural childhood expression had been reframed as a potential death sentence for the person she loved most. "She made me practice being quiet for hours," Lucia revealed during one particularly difficult conversation. "She would time me to see how long I could go without making any sound at all. She said it was training to keep you alive, like you were training soldiers to keep everyone safe. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, Elena had convinced Lucia that her father's deployment had been extended because she hadn't been quiet enough during their video calls. She said that every time I talked to you, the army decided you had to stay longer because I was still too loud and needed more time to learn how to be good. Today, Lucia is rediscovering the joy of communication. Her voice has returned gradually, first in whispers, then in normal conversation, and now sometimes in the loud, enthusiastic bursts that had characterized her early childhood. She attends a school where teachers understand trauma, participates in drama therapy that celebrates vocal expression, and most importantly, lives in a home where every word she speaks is treasured. The journey back to confident communication wasn't instant, but each day brought small victories. The first time she raised her hand in class, the first time she called out to a friend across a playground, the first time she sang along to a song on the radio. Each moment was a victory over the fear that had been systematically installed in her young mind. Rodriguez keeps a recording on his phone, not from their deployment video calls, but from a recent evening when Lucia spent 20 minutes excitedly telling him about everything she had learned at school that day. Her voice is bright, confident, and completely unafraid, exactly as it should be. The healing process involved multiple specialists working together to address different aspects of Lucia's trauma. Speech therapists helped her rediscover the full range of her vocal abilities, while play therapists used games and activities to rebuild her confidence in self-expression. Child psychologists worked with both father and daughter to process the systematic abuse and develop healthy communication patterns. One of the most significant breakthroughs came during family therapy, when Lucia was encouraged to speak at different volume levels in a safe, controlled environment. The first time she spoke in her full, natural voice without immediately apologizing or checking for disapproval, both she and Rodriguez cried with relief. Music therapy proved particularly effective in Lucia's recovery. Elena had specifically forbidden singing, claiming it was the most disruptive form of sound production. Reclaiming her ability to sing, first humming quietly, then singing softly, and eventually belting out her favorite songs with joy, became a powerful symbol of her liberation from psychological control. The school she now attends has implemented new protocols for recognizing signs of psychological abuse in children. Teachers are trained to notice when naturally expressive children become suddenly quiet or withdrawn, understanding that dramatic personality changes often signal trauma rather than improved behavior. Rodriguez has become an advocate for military families, working with base commanders to establish better oversight systems for children of deployed service members. His experience has led to new requirements for regular welfare checks and mandatory training for anyone providing care for military children. This story is about more than one father and one daughter. It's about understanding that abuse doesn't always leave physical marks, that stealing a child's voice can be just as damaging as any other form of cruelty, and that the right to communicate freely is fundamental to human development. It's about recognizing that children who become suddenly quiet, withdrawn, or fearful of speaking may be experiencing psychological abuse that's just as serious as any other form of maltreatment. It's about the importance of creating environments where children feel safe to use their voices, ask questions, and express themselves without fear. Most importantly, it's about the power of patience, love, and professional support to help a stolen voice find its way back. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't won on a battlefield. It's achieved in the quiet moments when a child feels safe enough to speak their truth, and when that voice, once silenced by fear, rings out clear and strong again. The sound of a child who has been taught to whisper in terror should never be acceptable, should never be dismissed as good discipline or natural shyness. Because that child might be someone's Lucia, and that someone might be risking everything to come home to them. Lucia's journey from terrified whispers back to confident communication didn't just heal her relationship with her father. It exposed the reality that psychological abuse is just as serious as physical violence, and that every child deserves the right to speak, question, and express themselves without fear. Some battles aren't fought with weapons or on foreign soil. Sometimes the most important fight happens in a child's bedroom, where stolen voices learn they're safe to speak again, and where love proves stronger than the fear that tried to silence them forever. If this story moved you, remember that there are children everywhere who have been taught to make themselves small and quiet, to suppress their natural curiosity and joy. Be the voice that tells them it's safe to speak up, safe to ask questions, and safe to take up space in the world with their words and laughter.